Greetings and welcome. I'm truly excited to be able to share this wonderful conversation with Dr. Thomas Cowan. We cover a variety of important topics, such as his highly controversial theories regarding the myth of contagion. We go on to dispel several mainstream beliefs pertaining to the structure and function of the heart. And towards the end of the interview, we also touch briefly on my theories regarding the topics of biogeology and petrified heart stones. For those of you not already familiar with his work, Dr. Cowan is a well-known alternative medical doctor, author, and speaker with a common-sense holistic approach to health and wellness. He's lectured extensively throughout the U.S. on a variety of subjects in health and medicine, and has authored no less than 6 best-selling books, including The Contagion Myth, Cancer and the New Biology of Water, and Human Heart, Cosmic Heart. For 35 years, Dr. Cowan ran a general medical practice, and following a recent retirement from active practice, launched 2 businesses with his wife and 2 sons. The first of them, Dr. Cowan's Garden, offers high-quality vegetable powders and kitchen staples. And the second distributes information about his work, hosts his popular webinar series, and offers many of the products he has used personally and in practice. And now, without further ado. Got it. Very nice. Well, thank you very much for agreeing to talk to me. I appreciate it. I've been a huge admirer of yours for quite some time. Over the last few years, I've seen a number of your interviews and presentations, and have followed your work and the work of Andrew Kaufman as well. I admire what you guys have done and what you've been willing to put yourselves on the line to share information that's anything but part of the mainstream narrative. And I'm reminded
that's an understatement.
Yeah. I'm reminded of the statement that in times of oppression, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And you guys are definitely revolutionaries. And I thank you for all you've done. I've read your Cosmic Heart book, and actually just today, this one came in the mail, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm looking forward to it. And I took interest in your work because a number of my patients, my subscribers on my YouTube channel reached out and said, "Oh, you should contact Tom Cowan and speak with him." And the reason is for the research that I've done on my channel, which I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at any of that or not.
I know a little bit.
A little bit.
They say enough to be dangerous, as they say.
Right. Yeah. It's way out there, and
it seems fine to me. I mean, I'm no expert, so.
Right. Well, we can talk more about that at the end. I'm really interested in talking about you and the work you're doing, and the ideas with regards to the myth of contagion, and I'll just start by the quote that I read in your book, The Cosmic Heart, Human Heart, that understanding the cosmic heart is the key to unlocking the larger context that we humans currently find ourselves in. It provides a blueprint for the healthier, happier, and more joyous world that we know in our hearts is possible. Such knowledge can help us to break the spell of the cult of scientism that threatens to kill us. And so I just thought maybe you could just start off by expanding a little bit on that. Because, I mean, first of all, you're preaching to the choir with me. I'm totally in agreement that that's what's taking place. But just the idea of the cult of scientism, maybe you can just expand on that a little bit to begin.
So I guess I would say I'm not a cult expert, but my understanding is that there's probably a lot of features, but the main feature I'm referring to with a cult is that you end up believing things because a person says so, and you have no idea how that belief came about. And when you're in that situation as a man or a woman or a human being, you're very vulnerable, because you're no longer thinking about what's in your best interest or deciding what's right for you. In some ways, you're not even able to access your feeling about what's right and act on that. You're simply believing what somebody says. And as I've said, beliefs lead to actions, and actions have consequences. So, I always like to give people very specific examples of what I mean by that. So if you want me to do that, I can do that.
Sure.
So we've been in this, and so we can pick this up with the virus thing. There's literally hundreds of examples of how this plays out. I could go through so many of them, but one of the most relevant now is what I call the virus cult. Now, we've all been through approximately 3 years of a life, culture, world-changing event based on a virus, right? That's what they say it's based on. I mean, that's not me saying that. That's what everybody says. The reason for doing all these things is because of a virus. Now, I'll get, and these are actually true depictions. So I get called by the head science editor at some major magazine. And he says, essentially, Tom, you're an idiot for saying there's no such thing as viruses. And we're doing a story to tell the people what an idiot you are. And we wonder if you have any comments. Okay, fair enough. So I ask a simple question. Now, this is the science editor of a major magazine. Okay, how does a virologist show that there is such a thing as a virus? And there's a pause, right? And he says, well, the majority of virologists agree there's a virus. So in other words, what he's saying is the principle of how we know what's true is if most of the people say so. So, of course, being the smart aleck that I am, I said, what percentage of virologists have to agree that there's a virus before it becomes true? He couldn't come up with a number, because if he said 100%, I know 3 who say there isn't, which means it must be not true. But then you go down the list of people who don't know how to answer that question, right? So they believe there's a virus, and you say, how do you know? Like, what's the method that would tell you there is or there isn't? And not only don't they know whether the method has been used, they don't know the method. And that includes essentially 100% of lay people, about 99% of medical doctors. It includes about 98% of the freedom activists who can't tell you how you would know whether there's a virus or not. And so they give all kinds of reasons like, well, everybody believes it. Or how do you explain that a lot of people got sick? Now think about that. The principle is if a lot of people get sick in the same place with the same symptoms, that proves it's a virus. So in other words, like Hiroshima was a virus. Or, if a lot of people get sick, with so-called scurvy on a ship, then that must be a virus. They have the same symptoms, one after another. If you have 100 rats in your basement and you put rat poison and then they all bleed to death one after another, then that proves that rat poison is a virus. So it's magical thinking. Well, it's not actually thinking. It's magical belief system, which is the hallmark of a cult, right? And if you say, but that's ridiculous, like that's not how any scientist thinks. Well, how do you explain that Aunt Bessie went to church and then she got sick when she came home? Right? So in other words, you're saying the question is, how do virologists know? So you're saying that a group of virologists at the NIH, they come into work, they put on their hazmat suit, they sit around a big table and they say, anybody know if Aunt Bessie got sick yesterday? Guy says, yep, she did. I know it. Aunt Bessie got sick. There you go. We got a paper proving there's a virus. Right?
Right.
That's ridiculous. And yet that's what people are walking around thinking. Or they say, oh, this is an irrelevant question. Which, right, the whole thing is based on the answer to this question, but we're not going to ask this question because it's too divisive and people can't understand, even though it's extremely easy to understand. It takes about an hour or so, and then you know the whole story, and that's the end of it.
So ideally, you would apply the scientific method and you would find a way of isolating these nasty particles that are getting people sick in some way, that you could actually visualize them and prove that they're there, and then actually use those in order to get somebody else sick. That's
yeah, I mean,
right?
it's you know, I can give a million examples, but the one I gave was, if somebody says, I used to use a ping pong ball, but that's not a really good example. Now I use a jing ball, because imagine you don't know whether there's such a thing as a jing ball, right? So, Mike, I'm going to prove to you there's a jing ball. So I'm going to take a bucket. I'm going to make a wall out of bricks. And I'm going to take a bucket and I'm going to fill it with stones and rocks and screws and nails. And it may or may not have a jing ball in it. And then I throw it at the wall and the wall knocks down, and that proves that jing balls knock down the wall. Now I'm going to do a control, because you got to do a control. And I'm going to take a bucket with nothing in it, has air in it. Not nothing, has air in it. I'm going to throw the air at the wall, and the wall doesn't fall down, and that proves that there's a jing ball, and jing balls knock down the wall. Now, is that true?
In your imagination.
Right. So what's the trouble? The trouble is the scientific method says you start with an observable fact, or something that you know exists. And then you make a dependent variable, something that happens, like the wall falls down. And then you have an independent variable, meaning the jing ball, which you have by itself, right?
Right.
And then you throw the jing ball at the wall. That's the independent variable, and you see if the wall knocks down. And then, keeping all the conditions like the temperature in the room and the wind in the room, right? All those things as similar as you can to the jing ball throwing at the wall, you throw nothing at the wall. And then if the wall knocks down with only the jing ball, but not the air, you have demonstrated that it's the jing ball that knocks down the wall. Right? That's what we call science. Now, it's indisputable that nobody has ever found a particle that fits the definition of a virus in any biological fluid of any plant, animal, or human, sick or otherwise. And interestingly, nobody disputes that. Nobody disputes that. 225 or so NIH, CDC, British health authorities have all agreed with that. All virologists agree. They've never found this particle in anybody who's sick or any animal or plant. That's indisputable. So what do? Here's how they show that the virus exists and makes people sick. They take the snot from a sick person, right? They centrifuge it to get the big stuff out, like the bacteria and the cells. So now you don't have a virus, you just have the liquid from snot of a sick person. And then they put that on growing tissue, usually highly inbred monkey kidney cells. And then they add kidney poisons, they take away the nutrients, they add fetal calf serum, and then they see whether the cells break down. If they do, they say that proves there's a virus and the virus causes disease. And then they do a control, which is they put saline or a buffered saline instead of the snot, the centrifuge snot. That's exactly the Jing Jing ball experiment, because nobody has demonstrated there's no part of that experiment that is intended to demonstrate the existence of a virus, right? All you know is that sick person's liquid snot, along with along with antibiotics that are poisonous to kidney cells and starving the kidney cells, makes the kidney cells break down faster than if you don't put the snot in. And by the way, they never actually do the same. They put more antibiotics when they put the snot in than when they do the not snot. Because obviously there could be bacteria that we missed in the snot. And so there's no part of that experiment that's scientific or even intended to demonstrate the existence of this particle, let alone causing disease. No part of it. And yet that is indisputably the proof that that these particles exist and cause disease. That's it. And so hopefully everybody who hears that will say to themselves, okay, if he's right, meaning me, this is like fucked up. But he can't possibly be right. They can't be that stupid. But the fact of the matter is, there's been at least 6 times in history where the people who invented this technique of finding viruses, called a viral culture, they actually did it with controls. And they said, you know, the same thing happens whether we use something from a sick person or not. Proving that it's the technique of starving and poisoning cultures that makes them break down. There's at least 5 or 6 papers that have shown that, and our little group did it again, and we showed that without adding anything from anybody who's sick, you just add the antibiotics and take away the nutrients and add the fetal calf serum, that culture breaks down, proving that there's a virus, even though there was no possibility of a virus being in there. So it is actually disproven. And so there should be no interest in virology anymore. It should just go away. Or as our friend Mark Bailey wrote in his paper, a farewell to virology, like that's the end of it.
Right. And I think you've very thoroughly, in a number of presentations which are available on YouTube and other places, you've shown this, and you've referenced all of the studies and spoken with, you referred to a senior scientist at Wuhan who had many years at the top level in these subjects, and he was in agreement with you, from what I understand, when you pressed him for the specificities of how that could be so.
He's in agreement that you cannot find the virus in a sample from a sick person directly.
Right.
But even if you put 10,000 people together and essentially concentrated, and so when we ask him why, right? Because if you want to know whether there's elephants, you go to the ecosystem of the elephants and you see if there's anything that meets the definition of an elephant, right? That's how you do it. If you want to know whether there's frogs, you go to a pond, you say, I'm looking for something that goes ribbit and has, green and all that stuff. And even a bacteria, they're too small to see, but you can see them with a light microscope. You can look in somebody's mouth and you see these single cellular things moving around. Those are bacteria. So the principle of inquiry is you go to the ecosystem, look for what you see, and if you don't see it, you better have a good explanation for why you think it's there. Now, maybe you can hear it, and maybe it's too small, but or maybe there are not enough of it. So we asked him, why can't you see it in the lung snot of a sick person with COVID, they say. So his answer was, there's not enough virus to see. Now think about that for a minute. The theory is the virus kills you by mechanics, right? By exploding cells. That's what they say. And they say that the virus is the lungs are a perfect culture, right? That's what they say. They say there's 20 million of these virions, these individual viruses per sneeze. And yet you can't find a single one. And then the way you find it is by putting it into a inbred kidney culture, and somehow it emerges out of that instead of the natural host, which is the person's lungs. Now, this has gotten me into something that I'm sure you're very interested in, which is called the reification fallacy. You know what that is?
Yep.
I'm sure you do. Which means you take a concept of something that's not proven to exist, and you essentially pretend that it has characteristics and that it exists. And so you do that with a virus. You say, why can't you find it? Well, a virus is an intracellular parasite. Now, here's what's interesting about that. You haven't actually ever found it or shown that it exists. How do you know it's an intracellular parasite? It's an idea that you have that supposedly causes, so it's got DNA or RNA in the inside. How do you know that? You've never actually seen it or isolated it or purified it. You can't study something that you haven't shown exists. I mean, it's a comedy show, except it's not funny in its ramifications, but it's a stand-up comedy show.
And when you have a consensus, everyone is in agreement, right? Then you have dogma, and essentially what you're talking about is scientism, because as you said in your book also, you said it seems that science really isn't very scientific, right? Because you should be starting with something empirical and have a manipulable variable as you right. said. So,
but
yeah,
here's
so
the thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Here's the thing. I don't want anybody to leave thinking, wow, this is an unusual thing for science, because it turns out I can give you a list as long as my arm of the things that are reification fallacies, like ribosomes, right? So they say these ribosomes exist, and that's where RNA is translated into protein. I could show you pictures if you want, but every picture of a ribosome is a perfect circle on an electron microscope. Now, if you know how they got to that picture, they got it by taking tissue, grinding it up in a blender, freezing it to 120 degrees, staining it with heavy metals, dehydrating it, shooting an electron beam at it, and a few other things. And you mean to tell me that every picture of that thing in the cell is a perfect circle, meaning it was a perfect sphere in real life, and yet grinding it up in a blender didn't affect it? It's like saying, okay, you have an orange, that's a perfect circle or sphere, and I put it in a blender and I take a picture of the pieces, and by golly, they're all perfect circles. I mean, seriously, there is no chance. By the way, Harold Hillman did this work with, so there's no ribosome, there's no lysosomes, there's no nuclear pores, there's no endoplasmic reticulum, there's no lipid bilayer cell membrane, there's no synapses in nerves, there's no evidence that DNA has anything to do with heredity, there's no evidence that the ribosomes are an actual place where RNA is translated into protein. And I could go on and on.
Last night I was listening to another talk you gave, and you got me questioning whether cells even exist now.
Right.
So that's cellular debris, exosomes, cells getting rid of materials. This is something that was talked about a lot, at the beginning of 2020 when everything was going on. But it seems like you've moved on from that entirely. These ideas that maybe what we're thinking of as viruses are actually cellular refuse that's being expelled, to the point where we don't even know if cells exist, or at least not in the way that we're told. And that the process of trying to identify whether or not a virus is there is causing so much destruction to the tissues that what's left over, they look at it and they go, see, this is what we expected to find.
Yes.
After doing the voodoo cauldron with all of the, all of the different steps that seem pretty crazy.
Yeah. I mean, what I've learned in the last 3 years is a lot, and I would say anybody who hasn't learned a lot and changed how they see the world in the last 3 years is not paying attention. And
I said the same.
And what I mean by, so here, what have I learned? The two most important things in far as this conversation is, number one, how you look for something has a huge impact on what you find. That's number one. Number two, and this was a real lesson for me, is in proper science, there is no obligation to give a theory or hypothesis even of what is true. You're only looking for what isn't true.
Right.
So I don't need to know why somebody gets sick. I may have some ideas, and I talked about that, to accept that there's a virus. The issue is there a virus? Can you prove that, or you can't disprove it, but you can show that the evidence is, there is no evidence to conclude this thing exists. And so when I go back, and all the mistakes I made have been being suckered into either not knowing out of laziness, partly, how they arrived at something, or by being suckered into giving an idea of what was the problem or the conclusion or what's true, rather than sticking with, I don't know that isn't true. In other words, somebody says, if you ever studied rain in clouds, it's very complicated, how clouds form and they float around and all that. Somebody comes along and says, it's because there's a bunch of elephants floating around in the sky, pissing on the ground. Okay. Now, I would ask them, how high up are the elephants? About a mile. How big are they? Normal size elephant with pink, etc. Okay, so I go up in an airplane or something, and a mile, like he told me, and I look, and there's not a single elephant. And I do that over and over again. Any way they say, I can conclude there's no, that theory of why there's rain, that's not true. I still don't know why there's rain or clouds, but I know it ain't elephants.
So, yeah, so you get closer to the truth. You can't necessarily prove the truth, but you get closer to it by eliminating things that aren't the truth. And that's what the scientific method is for, essentially, right? So
Yeah.
I coined a term, paradigm blindness, because I think many suffer from it, because a lot of people, when they get into these kinds of things, they assume like all those scientists can't be lying. It's like, well, no, they might not be lying, but if they can get you asking the wrong questions, it doesn't really matter what your answers are. And that's the problem, is a lot of people are starting with these assumptions and beliefs about the nature of reality that they've been fed in their school books from the time they're little, right up through every level of college. And and so then everything, they're fitting it into something that actually doesn't match reality in any way. And sometimes things are going to match up in a way that seems like it makes sense. And then you build all kinds of other theories or protocols based on that. And we end up where we are today.
Yeah, exactly. It's a classic, sort of like Ponzi scheme or house of cards. One thing builds on another, and the only issue is and so you get into cells. How did they demonstrate the existence of cells in the first place? What's interesting about all these things is they all, for instance, for one thing, in science and a lot of other things, started between around 1850 and 1920. There was a huge change in the way we thought of, we being people, at least the dominant culture, thought about things. So that's when evolution and genetics and the germ theory and cell theory and a whole lot of, in public schooling, it's good to go to school and get otherwise known as indoctrination camps. And a whole lot of other things.
At its core, it's all reductionistic and mechanistic, and it's leaving out the spirit, essentially vitalism.
Yeah, I mean, that's one. Yeah. So the guy, Virchow, came up with the cell theory, and the reason he did was because he dissected an onion and saw these compartments and said, well, that must be the basis of all life. Well, that's a pretty big leap of faith. But then you think about it, first of all, nobody before that had ever talked about cells in living systems. Chinese, Ayurvedic, nothing. Nobody ever mentions it. And so when you think about how you find a cell under a microscope from a liver, say, you have to take it out of its living matrix, right? First thing, because you can't see it while it's in the normal healthy, intact liver. Now, that could be because we don't have the technology, but even if you don't have the technology, you have to admit, I can't visualize or hear or touch or smell or taste a liver cell in an intact liver, right? Can't be done. So I have to remove it from its living system. And then you have to ask the question, does removing a piece of your liver from your liver change what you see? Now, maybe it does and maybe it doesn't, but you can't assume that it doesn't. And so even then you can't see it. So you have to cut it up into little thin slices, right? Then you have to put dye on it, which poisons the cell or the tissue and makes compartments happen. So how do you know that the compartments didn't happen because you put osmium stain on it? I mean, I'm not saying, again, that I know that it does, but you better do a control experiment to show me that it doesn't. And that's what Harold Hillman did. He said, you see these little round circles that they calling ribosomes? I'll make that same appearance from starting from something that's not living. And he did, and he stained it, and he froze it, and he got these little air bubbles, and they're indistinguishable from ribosomes. And so that makes it clear that you cannot use that picture to prove they're ribosomes, because he just proved you can make the same picture without anything from anything living, so it can't possibly have a ribosome in it. Same with viruses. I have a thing I call my pumpkin challenge, which is my cat, who I taught to say yes or no, and I showed him 12 pictures of either virus or SARS-CoV-2 or kidney debris from the 90s, right? And I said, Pumpkin, which is which? And he always says yes. So he said yes, and he got 7 out of 12 correct, right? Because he likes to say yes. He likes his right hand. And so I don't think any virologist could do better than that, because they are indistinguishable. Debris from the electron microscope published pictures of SARS-CoV-2, which tells you that you can't use that as evidence that that's a virus, because it's the same picture from just broken down kidneys. Now, it doesn't even prove they're cells. Like, I wish I had never gone down that whole exosome route. Because as far as I can see, you take tissue and you starve and poison it, or if it comes from a sick person, and it's just debris.
Breaks down.
Yeah, it breaks down, then you stain it and freeze it, and you get little bubbles and pictures and little circles, and that has no relationship to anything in a living system. So I am now officially to the point of any medical diagnostic test that interferes with the living system, I don't take as being validated.
Yeah, so this is a whole systems approach where I'm thinking of this concept of, a frogness. What does it mean to be a frog? Gets into this whole terrain versus microbe theory of, a bunch of frogs are found dead. Is it because they had a genetic mutation and suddenly all croaked at the same time, or did, something poison them upstream? And so you want to look at the creature in relationship to its environment. You want to look at its internal environment in the form of its health and what it's ingesting and that sort of thing. And you're going to learn a lot more about it by watching it interact with its environment than by cutting it open and going, here's a part and here's a part, and they seem to fit together.
Yeah. I would say I can't equivocally or unequivocally say there's nothing to be learned by examining dead stuff as far as living.
Clearly.
But the Chinese medicine, they didn't examine dead people. They had a person, they felt their pulse or looked at their tongue or asked them questions or understood what day they were born. And those are all evaluation strategies that don't interfere, at least not very much, right? You could say, well, feeling somebody changes their dynamics, but not very much. Or looking at somebody's tongue, go like that. That didn't change my tongue very much. Those are valid measurements or ways of evaluating the integrity or health of a living system. As soon as you cut something up and put it under a microscope and stain it and put buffers and acids, you're dealing with artifacts.
Right.
And that's the whole medical scientific system. They're dealing with artifacts and uncalibrated, unvalidated, uncontrolled observations, which when every single one, when you get into it, doesn't actually add up. They say DNA makes the proteins, right? We're made of proteins, they say. So how do you get proteins? They're coded for by the DNA, right? You know how many proteins there are in a human being? They say 200,000. You know how many genes there are? 20,000. So who codes for the other 180? Right? There's a problem there, which is that those thought patterns make no sense. They make no sense. And somehow that is escaped. Here's another one. It's one of my favorites. They say the DNA is in the nucleus, right? Makes RNA in the nucleus. That's what they say. Goes out of the nucleus to the ribosomes, which don't exist, and gets translated into protein. That's evolutionary genetic theory 101, right?
That's what I learned in chiropractic college, yeah.
Okay. Now, here's a question. There's nucleus has a membrane. You can see it it doesn't mean there's cells, but there's membrane around the nucleus. You can also stick a probe in the cytoplasm and the nucleus. The pH is different. Okay, that's an observable, repeatable fact. Now, in order for the pH of the cytoplasm and the nucleus to be different, the hydrogen ions are not able to freely equilibrate. Right? You with me? That's obvious. Now, an RNA that gets out of the nucleus and goes into the cytoplasm is, let's just say conservatively, 100,000 times bigger than a hydrogen ion. Right? I mean, it's a complex, long molecule, hugely bigger than a tiny little hydrogen ion. So how is it that this RNA can get out of this compartment and yet not let the hydrogen ion equilibrate? That's like, I got a door and I'm going to let the elephants out, but the mosquitoes are not going to let the mosquitoes go in and out. How is that possible?
It's not.
It's not.
Not possible.
So they invent the whirligig that attaches to the mosquito and gets it to shoot its way out. And they invent the endoplasmic reticulum, which is a tube that attaches to the inside of the nucleus and squires the RNA out, right? Except then there's these 12 tubes per cell, they say, attaching the nuclear membrane to the cell membrane wall. And then they see the nucleus going round and round, and somehow it doesn't mess up the tethers that are, and you think,
Tom, I'd like to pivot a little bit from one set of BS to another. You know, we were all taught in school that the heart is a pump and that it's pushing the blood. And I linked a 1-minute video to you that did you have a chance to see that 1-minute video?
No.
It's a little TikTok video that I made talking about the heart and basically discussing the discoveries of Francisco Torrent Guasp. And so I'll link that in the video when I edit the video so that people can see that. And I'd also like to know, once you've seen it, if there's anything that you disagree with, because I could always go back and change some of the information if necessary.
Did you know that almost everything you were taught about the heart is wrong? Most everyone today, even doctors, still believe the heart to be a 4-chamber pump that pushes blood through a mind-boggling 60,000 miles of narrowing blood vessels to fuel our 40 trillion cells, then filling again as if by magic on relaxation. Well, that theory was thoroughly debunked by the Spanish cardiologist Francisco Torrent Guasp back in 1972. After dissecting thousands of hearts, Guasp finally discovered the heart's true structure. The heart's far more amazing than we ever knew. It's like a rope, a long tube wrapped into a knot. Instead of being pushed, the blood is pulled through the heart in two spiraling vortexes. This has been proven with CAT scans, functional MRI, and positronic emission. Look at the spiraling contraction. It changes everything we know about the heart and circulation. If you'd like to know more, check out these videos.
You mentioned in your email to me that you thought, because when I read your book, the first thing I did when I got the book was, go to the index, because I made a video about 3 years ago called Helical Hearts, Petrified Organs, and Synchronicities, which was talking about the works of Francisco Torrent Guasp and relating it also to Schauberger's work as well, with water and vortexing of water. Yeah. And these were total mind blows for me, because going to chiropractic college, we learned nothing about any of this. And so when in your message to me, you mentioned Frank Chester, also discoverer of the Chesterhedron, whose work I haven't gone into very deeply, but you said that you felt that Guasp's understanding of the heart and model was maybe a little closer to the reality of what's going on.
Yeah.
And the little video that I'll be posting, it shows these problems with the mainstream theory of this pushing the blood out to the 70 trillion cells with increasingly narrow tubes and viscosity and all of that. And I'm just wondering if you could just expand a bit on well, first of all, what it was like to come across Francisco Guasp's work after you wrote this book, and how that affected your understanding of the heart and what it meant to you.
I mean, the reality is, the problem with writing a book is everything you write turns out, not everything, a lot of it turns out to be wrong. And I'm trying to decrease my percentage of being wrong as time goes on. But it's partly because I didn't appreciate enough, these two principles of how you look determines what you find. And I don't have to say what it is. I just have to prove that it isn't. So, sticking to that, the first step is the heart is not a pump. Now, what does that mean? So to be clear, we're talking about a pressure propulsion device, because there's a lot of different kind of pumps. And what we're specifically saying is, or what I'm saying is, the contraction of the muscle of the heart generates the force that moves and pushes the blood. That's what I mean by a pump. And there's a whole lot of reasons why that can't possibly be true. The first one is that you have, these thousands of miles of blood vessels with this sticky fluid with stuff in it that's about the caliber of the small vessels. The amount of force that you would need to generate to push all that fluid around those thousands of miles is literally hundreds, if not thousands of times more than a 1 pound muscle could generate. So that already makes you think this can't be. The second reason is, if you make a flow diagram, heart, arteries, capillaries, veins, back to the heart, then it stops at the capillaries and does like a little shimmy. And so it's slower and slower and slower, stop, faster and faster and faster, same speed about entering and exiting. Why would you put a pump at the fast part and not where it stops? The pump has to be where it stopped, right? And there's no pump, they say, in the muscles and organs and tissues. So that doesn't make any sense either. You can't pump to zero and then start going again and claim that the motive for the movement is at the top, not the bottom.
And then the heart is passively filling on relaxation also, which also makes no sense. They say it gets a little help from the veins, the valves in the veins as we walk, but what about a person who's not walking?
Yeah. But the biggest problem is if you look at the exit of the heart, it's called the aortic arch. And it's a flexible tube. So it's a arch that can go this way or this way, right? This way or this way. Now, anybody who knows anything about like watering their garden, so you have a garden hose that's shaped like an arch, right? You put a spigot on it and it's shaped like an arch, and you turn the spigot on really hard and the hose will straighten, right? And then it relax, straighten. But what you see, and it's easy to see, is that in systole, where the quote pumping supposedly happens, the arch bends in.
Relaxing.
So you're right, or a suctioning in. So there cannot possibly be a push. That's just, it's essentially disproven. So there's nothing else that needs to be said about that. So then you could say, well, okay, we know it isn't a pressure propulsion device. We know that the motive for the movement has to come from the tissues, the periphery, because that's where it stopped. So without getting into how that happens, you could say, well, the blood starts moving. It moves up the veins, goes faster and faster and faster, just like water in a river as it coalesces into a central river from a wetland. It goes faster, goes into the heart, expands the chamber, and then when a certain pressure differential between inside the chamber and the outside pressure difference builds up, the gate opens and there creates a suction and a vortex, and then the blood passively goes out from there. And that's it. I mean, that's how it works. And so then, you know, when you put in, you know, I heard about torrent guasp, and then I became friends with Manel Ballister, who's a cardiologist, who's one of his main students. And so, you know, we talked about this, and he's got a very clear model of the anatomy of the heart, how it's formed, and it's nothing like, you know, we learn in cardiology. And it gives you a very clear picture of the cycles of the heart and how it expands and contracts, and how it twists and creates these vortices, which then imbues it with this, you know, energy of formation, or whatever word you want to use for that. You know, it's the spiral of life, essentially. And yeah, it's all worked out. So that's so like we're done with that. That's clear.
Yeah, the first time I saw the documentary, you know, talking about his life, there's a portion where he's unraveling the heart, you know, the myocardioventricular band. And, you know, first of all, it's empirical. Second of all, it's self-evident that it is one long continuous band, right? It's just obvious when you see it, and he was the first to discover that, so it's a monumental discovery. Unless Rudolf Steiner didn't talk about that at all, right? You're very familiar with his work. So that was monumental. And then later on, he saw a CAT scan, you know, and he was able to see some vortexing of the flow of the blood inside the heart, and actually witness that. And that was when he started realizing that, you know, it was helical, and that there was a vortexing that was happening. So at that point, that was a theory. But then later on, through functional MRI, positronic emission, through just blowing hearts up with gas, and then doing CAT scans as it's expanding and contracting, they were able to show that it's helical, but it's two opposite rotating helical vortices. And so that was such a mind blow for me, and really paradigm shifting.
I mean,
and it ties into magnetics, and it ties into, you know, all sorts of things. So
and that's where it's the central creator of the electromagnetic field, which is the basis of life. So right, it's very clear, it's very precise, and it's not just a model, it's an accurate description of what you see. And what you see without interfering with, it's like I was saying before, you can look, and I have nothing against like looking at something in real time, assuming that how you're looking at it didn't change what you're looking at. But to me that, or we've used things to measure the biophoton emission from different types of living things. So all you're measuring is the light that is emitted from a seed or an elephant or whatever, a sick person or a healthy person. That is a appropriate use of extended observation tools, right? Because you're not staining, dying, killing. You're just measuring how much light comes out of your heart when somebody says you're going to get killed by a virus versus, yeah, no viruses, you don't have to worry about. It's different or not. And that's where medicine needs to go. And that's where biology needs to go. That's where science needs to go. But, they're caught in this cult thing, so they're not going there. So we go there ourselves.
Yes. You described William Harvey's theory as a death blow to vitalism.
Except that's one of those things I didn't quite get right, because Harvey actually was the guy who said that the circulation is a circuit. And I think he was correct about that. He didn't actually say the heart was a pump. We say he said it, but I've now read our direct writings from Harvey, and I don't think he didn't say that. He was actually still a vitalist. It was really Descartes in the late 1800s, I think, or 17, whatever. Not sure when he lived, who said we have to think of every living system as a machine. So the heart became the pump.
Right.
So Harvey had a little bit to do with it, but it's one of those, I was a little bit lazy with that and not looked into it enough. So he's a little bit falsely accused.
So how does the heart, the blood begin to return? You could maybe go into that a little bit. That gets into structured water and
it's basically
the exclusion zones and all of that.
When water forms into its plasma or fourth phase, it separates charges, and then the positive charges go in the middle and they repel each other and start movement. And you can visualize that. You can do experiments, and you can even do experiments to see what interferes with that, with the velocity or the strength of the movement. So, I mean, it's the same way. It's the same way all fluids move in nature. And Torrent Guask put other things. There's suction from above, so that helps draw up there's probably even this iron in the blood creates an electromagnetic field around the heart, and that probably in a sort of magnetic way pulls up the blood, the iron in the blood. And then there's this structured water component that creates a separation of charges, and that also has something to do with the movement. So there's probably a lot of overlapping.
In that video I made 3 years ago about GWASP, one of the things that struck me when I realized more about his theories, I was looking at the form of red blood cells. Now you've got me doubting that that's actually accurate. But if you look at red blood cells, they look like toroids. They look like little magnets, essentially. They've got magnetic, like little floating magnetic fields.
Right.
So my first thought was, you've got the exclusion zone, you've got the blood plasma, which is filled with the lipids and whatnot, and then you have the red blood cells that are floating in that. So you've got they're slipping along in the fatty material, but then they're also they've got the hemoglobin and the red blood cells, so they've got the iron in the hemoglobin. And so I just immediately started theorizing that there must have been some kind of electromagnetic propulsion of the blood through the bloodstream.
Yes, there is. That's how it works. But again, Manel Ballister, in some ways it's interesting because I a little bit gave up the heart quest because I ran across somebody who was more advanced than I was. So when I find that, I just say, here, you do it. Because
I've not heard of him. So
yeah, he has written a number of papers, and we had a whole summit and on the new biology and the new medicine, and he gave a fabulous talk on what a heart is and how the blood moves. And he was he's a cardiologist by training. He was you live in Spain, right?
Yes, I do.
He was chosen by the Spanish government to be the cardiologist for their heart transplant center years ago. So he was a well-known cardiologist, and then eventually thought, this is nuts. But so he's a really good candidate, a good person to take up this, the details and the mechanics and actually what's happening with movement. And he was one of Tornquist's, I think, primary students.
Yeah, Gerald Buckbird was one of the people who really propelled his work forward and helped the world to discover it, because he was struggling with recognition of his theories for a couple decades, because there was so much resistance, because it basically shattered the cardiological paradigm.
Right.
So he was a real revolutionary as well. I titled that video that I mentioned before, petrified helical hearts, petrified organs, and synchronicities. And one of the synchronicities was that I had already been doing a lot of research into the things that my channel is all about, which we haven't discussed at all. But I was finding a lot of stones that I believe to be petrified hearts, most of them, and there are a tremendous number of anatomical correlations, and it's an extremely repeatable phenomenon. It's entirely empirical based, and the mainstream model doesn't match what I'm finding at all, because they say they're just lumps of clay that have hardened in sedimentary layers and then popped out and then have eroded in that fashion. And there are so many anatomical correlations that makes no sense. And the frequency with which I can find these very, very, very specific stones is off the charts. You can't even imagine if you're not familiar with the work. So one of the synchronicities was that when I saw the video on Guasp's life, and he unraveled the heart and then he rolled it back up, first of all, my mind was blown just finding out that, everything I knew about the heart was wrong, But second, when he rolled it up, there were these meeting points, the intraventricular sulcus and these other points that started to match up, and I saw the lines where those parts of the folds of the heart would meet with the different fibers going different directions, and I just went, oh my gosh, the stones that I've been gathering, they've had these lines also. So by seeing that documentary on his life, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it again. So I rushed back to the collection and started looking at these stones, and sure enough, a ton of them had it. And then later on, I discovered a further specificity, which is that if you take the stones and you look at them from the bottom, they have a twist to them. So you get the helical aspect to it as well. So you've got sulcus lines, you've got indentations or openings where the aorta and the vena cava would be. You have the twisting, you have the tapering in because of the contraction that would happen on death through rigor mortis. It was just way, way, way too many things lining up. And then the biggest mind blow of all was that where I live is literally 10 minutes drive from where Torrent Guasp lived and worked his whole life. So that was a pretty massive like tap on the shoulder,
Yeah.
so that, yeah. One of the reasons I wanted to reach out
So
to you
you
is
don't know
because,
Manel Ballister, right?
no, never
You
heard
should
of the name.
you should show him these hearts.
Yeah, I've been looking for somebody. Like I mentioned in my email to you, there's a cardiologist who I'm friends with now, but he doesn't want to go on, on camera or on record talking about these things because he's concerned about the repercussions. But I would just love to be able to talk to somebody with that kind of knowledge and experience and actually show the stones, because there's an expression in Swedish, they say utocykla, which means you're out cycling. In other words, it's another way of saying you're nuts. I might be out on a bike ride or something. And if it is, then it's just a cosmic joke that's been organized against me, because there have been so many times where there have been these synchronistic events that have coincided with, many, many other things. So it's not like I had this crazy theory that I just wanted to run with. It's more like I made discoveries that didn't make any sense. And as I tried to understand them more, I made further and further discoveries that were all in support of this idea. So
do you
yeah.
have an idea or any evidence for like whose hearts they were?
Well, I get people that are asking like, well, what did you think there was some kind of like a massive ritual that took place and the hearts were removed and then somehow turned to stone? I'm like, no, that's not, I'm finding them from millimeters up to feet. I've got a massive one here I could show you. I'll do it at the end. It's big and heavy, but, so it didn't make any, initially, you might've heard of mud fossil theory. Have you come across that at all? So that was something I was exposed to like 4 years ago. And as I started to like look at geology with new eyes, and well, wow, because that kind of explains a lot of these rocks I've seen throughout my life, that like, how did that form based on just things dying and then compressing? How does this happen?
Yeah.
And it didn't make any sense to me. And so when I saw this channel, Mud Fossil University, talking about this theory, I was like, well, that makes some sense. And then I was frustrated though, because so many of the rocks that were being shown, like claims were being made out of them, like, look, this is a such and such, and you can just, it is what it is, but he apparently ran DNA tests on a few of his samples that came back humanoid. So that, he's got the lab analyses that are there on his web page and whatnot. So I thought, okay, well, he's gone deep into this stuff. He knows way more about chemistry than I do, and I'm not qualified in either geology or in chemistry to draw any conclusions. But I think it's a fascinating idea that matches what I'm finding when I'm looking at stones. And but I was frustrated, and I just sent out a request to the universe, like, hey, I would love to find something that was just indisputable, that could convince me once and for all that this is really a phenomenon. And I was walking in a river bottom a few days later, and I found this stone that's about 4 times the size of a human heart. And it's got, well, at the time I brought it home, brought out my anatomy books from school, and I'm looking at, I'm like, no way, no, and I had, by the end of the first day, I had like 12 to 15 different anatomical features in this one stone. That's up to like 25 now on one rock. So when you start to do the math on that, and what are the odds of finding just some randomly eroded stone that's going to have such incredible specificities, it makes no sense at all. So I took it as self-evident. It is what it appears to be. I didn't understand how a heart could be found petrified outside of the body. That was like, what, how does that happen? Where's the rest of the body? And then when I started finding more, I'm like, why organs outside the body? It doesn't make any sense. And where the bones, where the pelvis, the head, all these other things. And so as time went on, I'm like, well, I'm finding the findings, so I can't dispute what's here in front of me, but I don't understand it. So I'm not going to worry about that part. Maybe at some point, I'll be able to understand it better. And so the theory that I have is called boiled egg theory. And so my theory is that the outer portions of the body are being destroyed in some way through some kind of a massive cataclysmic event, whether it's plasma or heat or volcanic or electric I don't know what it
Yeah.
is. There's lots of examples of our realm being completely devastated, probably multiple times, and so if the forces were great enough, I was just thinking about a boiled egg. You start with a raw egg, you break it open, it's liquid inside. You put it in boiling water for 10 minutes and it hardens to the point where you might not want to eat it at that point. So I thought, well, what if we had pressure or great amounts of heat? Well, you've got the pleura of the chest cavity and the abdominal cavity and all the organs that are there, and each individual organ is wrapped in its own fatty sac. And the pericardium is the thickest of the fatty sacs of all of the organs. So I'm like, wow, so it's like a sac within a sac, and then you have the muscle itself. And I thought, well, what if the outer portions are being utterly annihilated and it's creating such pressure and heat inside that it's hardening this heart? And maybe it wouldn't harden to the point that it turned to stone, but maybe it's destroying the rest of the body. The heart is on its way to being stone, and then it's finished off the rest of the way by nature in some way.
Yeah.
And then you get your erosion and your whatever. And then I started wondering, well, what about the bones though? Where are those going? And that took a while to
well, it's great.
I
mean, it's a great inquiry.
And you just it's been a really bizarre venture. It's not something I ever bargained with,
yeah, but there you go. So keep going.
Thanks. I mean, you've got to go soon. You have a meeting, right? I just maybe, I mean, I'm gonna put links to all of your stuff, to your books, and to some of your talks that have been fantastic. And maybe you can share. You mentioned that there was a talk from this gentleman you mentioned, the cardiologist. I definitely would like to get some information from him.
We did a true healing conference it's probably a year and a half or so ago.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we can exchange some information about that. Yeah, I know. I was thinking about your mentor, Otto. You were talking about, I can't remember his last name, but you described Otto Wolff, and that he was just this master of so many different things. And you described him as knowing someone who knew tons about everything, but you also specifically mentioned stones and geology. And I really wonder what Otto would have thought of what I'm putting forth right now, because you said Otto, he doesn't suffer fools, and
right. It'd be interesting,
and neither do you either. So I'm really honored that you would take the time to talk to me, and especially considering how way out there some of these things that I've shown on my channel are. Maybe one last question, because you in the talk that you were giving, you're describing, essentially it's almost like, from what I understood, there's kind of two elements. You've got water and you've got quartz, and in varying mixes. Maybe I'm not getting that right, but the idea is that one is a dynamic living system, and the other is a storage system, and that the whole transhuman agenda wants us all to be silicone based and moving into more of a quartz environment. And so you talked about quartz can never grow or feel or evolve. It just adds more and more information. And I wanted to maybe whatever comes to your mind about what I just said.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a way of expressing that there's a reason why water is the basis of life, because it's essentially infinitely malleable. And in a way, that's like a metaphor for what we should be, especially because there's an attempt to crystallize us in all the ways we've been talking. In other words,
petrify.
Petrified. DNA is hereditary. That's who you are. So that's like petrified in stone. And what we need to be, like I think Bruce Lee said, be like water. And it's strong and can erode rocks, and yet it keeps moving, and hopefully leads you to what's real.
So vitalism versus mechanism,
Yeah.
water versus quartz, but
Water
obviously we are an interaction of all of those things.
Yeah.
And essentially we're all living under a false dichotomy, right?
Yeah.
Where this false division between spirit and matter, and mechanism versus vitalism. And this gets back to what I said at the beginning, quoting you, which is that we need to return to some kind of a whole systems theory approach to healthcare, which has been dramatically
to life in general.
lacking for a long time, and
Long
by
time.
design, unfortunately. So as we've learned more and more. So I hope that we can converse again. And it was really fun to speak with you. And
and we will send you this video so you can do with it.
Awesome. Yeah, please. I have some time today. I would love to to see it.
All right. Thank you.
And please send me this video also.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
All right.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Correlation. See the indentations at the top there? And then you've got that curve, that little knife edge, wider on one side. Oftentimes on the thicker side, there will be the openings to the pulmonary arteries as well. So that's my collection. 2 years of walking around, and these things jump out at me at the most synchronistic moments. And oh, here's the big one right here. Look at that. Beautiful, isn't it? Pulmonary artery opening. The tapering in that happens with contraction, the curved underside, and then as I turn it over, we've got the aortal opening, and there's even a ventricular sulcus. So it's scalable and it's reproducible. And as I've said before, people from all over the world have been sending me pictures and finding these, and yeah. So we'll see what Mr. Guasp has to say. Hope you're all well. Take care. Bye-bye.